Welcome, everyone, to Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. It's been well over a year since the January 6th uprising at the U.S. Capitol, and as a nation, we are still grappling with the shock and the fallout from this, what has really become a national trauma, both legally and politically. We're still struggling to understand how this could have happened and who was responsible. While we've explored this topic of Christian nationalism before on this show, and from different perspectives of history, religion, politics, and sociology, it's a subject that is still very much alive, and it's really a national wound that has not been healed, and one that brings up issues of such vital national importance that I think it's essential that we keep our focus on it, because our democracy is at stake here. And here to help us tonight is Dr. Philip S. Gorski. He's a professor of sociology at Yale University. I think I've heard of that university. He's a comparative and historical sociologist who writes on religion and politics in early modern Europe and North America. His work has been featured and discussed in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and other national media outlets. He's the author of many books, among them American Babylon, Christianity and Democracy Before and After Trump, American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present, and most recently he is the co-author of The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, which is just recently out. Dr. Gorski, thank you so much for making time for us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, S.J. Pleasure to be here.
Now, I think I know the answer to this question, but usually I ask our authors, how did you decide to write this book, and why now?
Well, as you noted in the introduction, I've been working on religion and politics for a very long time, and have been interested in the relationship between religion and nationalism for 25 years, initially just as an academic subject, but as I started working more on history and society in America about 15 years ago, I became increasingly interested in the role of Christian nationalism in American history and politics, and in recent years increasingly alarmed about the growing radicalization of Christian nationalists in the United States. And so teamed up with my friend and colleague Sam Perry to write a book, kind of trying to bring some of the research that's been done in this area to a broader readership outside of academia, and that's really what we tried to do with The Flag and the Cross. It's a jargon-free, fairly short, to the point, and really tries to relate this topic to kind of events that we're seeing all around us on January 6th and probably going into the future as well.
Now, just to be able to define some terms for our audience, in your book you distinguish among Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism, and then white nationalism. How do those terms differ, and how do they differ from, say, historic or biblical Christianity?
Sure. So, I think one of the reasons we actually wrote this book is I found myself increasingly using this term white Christian nationalism instead of just Christian nationalism. And one of the goals of this book was really to figure out, well, how exactly is race tied up in all of this? I think a lot of your listeners will have heard that this figure about 81% of white evangelicals voting for Trump in 2016, and roughly 83% voted for him again in 2020. And interesting thing that we show in the book is that there are plenty of Black Christians who score pretty highly on our Christian nationalism scale, but they have very different beliefs than white evangelicals do. And for them, America being a Christian nation really means something more like living up to its founding ideals. Think of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream," or looking over the mountaintop. That's really more what Black Christians understand by America being a Christian nation, living up to these higher ideals. But what we really found is with white Christian nationalists is that they have a very different perspective. It's really more about my tribe being on top, and the rights of my tribe vis-a-vis everybody else in the country. So it's not really quite the same thing as white nationalism, in the sense of the Ku Klux Klan or the Proud Boys. Though I will say that increasingly those right-wing radical white supremacists and militia groups are kind of using Christian nationalism as a fig leaf. They've sort of figured out that if they talk about, defending Christian civilization or the Judeo-Christian tradition, that they can kind of push a lot of the things that have always been on their agenda, but kind of conceal it in sort of higher-sounding rhetoric. So the relationship is between white nationalism and white Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is complicated, but what we really focus on in the book is white Christian nationalism.
Now, obviously, white Christian nationalism has deep roots in our history. Where does it come from, and how pervasive is it now?
Well, another one of the contributions that we're trying to make in the book is exactly that, is to answer the when question. So, it's pretty pervasive today. I think it would be fair to say that there sort of 10 or 15% of the American population is really kind of identifies very strongly with this Christian nationalism. They're kind of hardcore Christian nationalists. That means that, they believe things like, Christians should be privileged. There doesn't need to be separation of church and state. There should be, kind of collective prayer in public schools. American law should be based on Christian morality. The Constitution should somehow reflect the Christian origins of the United States. So, pretty strong views. And then there's, probably another 25, 30% of the population which sympathizes with those degrees with those views to one degree or another. So it is pretty pervasive. But one of the tasks we really set in this book is to kind of trace it back and really see how it's developed over time. And we kind of came to the conclusion that it's goes all the way back to the late 17th century. So like 1690, roughly speaking, is the date that we emphasize. So very, very deep roots. I think this for a lot of folks, particularly, sort of more mainline Christians or liberal Christians or, secular progressives, Christian nationalism just didn't really register with them until January 6th. That's really when the term kind of made the jump from kind of scholarly discussions to kind of journalistic articles and public discussions and even, broadcast news.
Now, you brought up the date 1690, so I'll ask this question now. That in your book you distinguish between, in our history, the spirit of 1776 and what you call the spirit of 1690. What is that date, and why is it significant?
Well, some people will say, "Gosh, you talk about Christian nationalism, and this sounds like a sort of a slander to me, or kind of a made up term, and none of this frankly sounds very Christian to me. I mean, what does Christianity have to do with being kind of for the police and the military, or against Black Lives Matter and critical race theory, or what does it have to do with being against masking and vaccines? I mean, I don't see what that has to do with Christianity at all. And I mean, theologically speaking, I think people say that have a point, but the fact is that white Christian nationalism is rooted in a certain understanding of Christian scripture. It may be an erroneous understanding, but nonetheless, white Christian nationalism as a kind of ideology is rooted in a certain understanding of Christian scripture. And so the way that we describe white Christian nationalism is as a deep story. And it's historically deep, in the sense that it does go way back. And it runs something like this. The United States was founded as a Christian nation. The founders themselves were, in some sense, traditional Christians or evangelical Christians or Orthodox Christians. The founding documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, are based on biblical principles. And the United States has a kind of a special role to play, a providential role to play in history. It's supposed to spread freedom or religion or civilization or prosperity or capitalism. And for that reason, because it's been entrusted with this special mission, it's been given, blessed with enormous power and prosperity. But, and this is, I think, an important point today, because of the increasing presence of non-Christians or non-whites or non-native born people on American soil, that power and prosperity and the mission itself are all in danger. So that's the essence of the deep story. And you might say, well, all right, again, where does that come from, and what does that have to do with 1690? So we argue that the deep story of Christian nationalism really weaves together three different stories or three different interpretations of stories in Christian scripture. And the first is the Promised Land story. So this is the idea that the New World, what becomes the United States, is kind of promised land, promised to the New England Puritans, promised to all of their successors, but that the land is occupied. It's occupied by Native Americans, or it's occupied by French settlers, or it's occupied by Mexicans who have to be driven out, or if necessary, exterminated. So that's the Promised Land story. Then there's a sort of end time story, which says what's going on in America right now. American history is part of this bigger drama, the story of the end times, and these struggles that the United States is engaged in. These aren't just struggles between, flesh and blood human beings. These are struggles between powers and principalities, between good and evil in America, and Americans, of course, are squarely on the side of the good. And then the last piece is what we call the racial curse story, and this is the so-called curse of Ham, the notion that all Africans are descendants of Ham and therefore condemned by God to eternal bondage or servitude. And so why 1690 is important is because this is the moment where those three threads really get woven together into a single kind of knot, which is what we call white Christian nationalism. And kind of the key events there are the New England Puritans' wars with the native peoples, which they come to understand in terms of the Promised Land story and the end time story, and then also the racialization of enslavement in the United States, right? The idea that kidnapped Africans are slaves by virtue of being Africans, by virtue, that is, of being descendants of Ham, and that also comes together around 1690. And so that's kind of a long answer, but that's what we understand by the sort of deep story that underlies white Christian nationalism, and that's why we see 1690 as a kind of a pivotal date when these three kind of scriptural threads get woven together.
1690, was that you including, was it King Philip's War? If I remember my high school history, King Philip's War, when the English settlers really began to turn en masse against the native population in New England.
Yeah, so there really are, there's sort of a series of wars, and, this Metacom's War, King Philip's War, which begins in the 1670s. That's really the kind of one of the bloodiest ones, really decimating both to New England settlers and even more so to the native peoples. And one reason for focusing on 1690 is, in a way, kind of the seminal text of the deep story in white Christian nationalism is this history that Cotton Mather, there's the three New England Mathers, father, son, and grandson, with Cotton being the grandson. And he really weaves together all three of these threads in a single history of New England, which really becomes incredibly influential in a subsequent understanding of the American project throughout history. So that's really, another reason. It's a kind of, the events, but also the text that makes 1690 such an important date.
In your book, you mentioned libertarianism, and how does libertarianism overlap currently with white Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so there's always been, so I guess the first thing to say is that there's always been a certain understanding of freedom in the United States, which understands freedom as opposed to slavery, and that means, of course, literal slavery, up through, the end of the Civil War, and that's a kind of freedom of a certain kind of freedom that that only really sort of propertied white men, free propertied white men can have. Kind of lives on today in in a certain kind of libertarianism that gets bound up with white Christian nationalism, and also has to do with race. And let me just give you a kind of an illustration of this. So, William Jennings Bryan, who was a progressive Democrat and around the turn of to the 20th century, ran for president all three times unsuccessfully. And he's often known today because of his role in the Scopes trial, the so-called monkey trial in the mid-1920s. But he was something that would be hard to find today. I mean, he was, on the one hand, very much of a white supremacist, but at the same time, a progressive Democrat. So basically, he wanted social and economic equality, but really only amongst white people. And what sort of happens over the course of the 20th century is, once you have Brown versus Board of Education, and then the various civil rights acts, voting rights acts in the 1960s, you can't really number one, you can't really just be openly a white supremacist anymore. This is really the beginning of a kind of dog whistle politics, welfare queens and so on and so forth. And libertarianism really just becomes a kind of a sort of a polite way of refusing racial equality. So the kind of turn towards a libertarian politics and away from progressive egalitarian politics really has to be seen against the backdrop of the the push for racial equality during the 50s and 1960s in the United States. And that's also the period in which, in a way, another person who you could look at that illustrates this perfectly is Strom Thurmond, the late senator, long-serving senator from South Carolina, who began his career as a progressive Democrat, was all for, the New Deal, as long as it was basically just a New Deal for white folks. And then when there was a push for racial integration, racial equality, he kind of had to choose between his racial politics and his economic politics, and he chose in favor of his racial politics and became a libertarian and a sort of a defender of segregation. And that was really kind of the inflection point where libertarianism, kind of becomes you could say it's a form of anti-racism. Might be a way of putting it. Libertarianism becomes a form of anti-racism.
Now, in your book, you see white Christian nationalism as something at the heart of the January 6th insurrection. We saw so many images of Confederate flags and crosses and nooses and images of you normally associate with the KKK and so forth. But you see white Christian nationalism as at the heart of that insurrection. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think the symbols were very revealing. I think a lot of folks who weren't really aware of this current in our politics kind of looked at the wooden gallows and the wooden cross and the Jesus Saves banners and the Trump flags and the Auschwitz hoodie and the Christian flags, and thought, what the heck is going on here? Who are these folks? How does this all fit together? But for us, it was pretty clear. I mean, the white supremacism, the hyper-nationalism, the sort of cultural Christianity, those all fit together very neatly into this package that we call white Christian nationalism. And that's not to say that everybody who embraces white Christian nationalism is, ready to march on the Capitol and try to overthrow the government. This was a very extreme expression of it, but it is interesting, the degree to which, folks who affirm white Christian nationalism, and we have the receipts on this, basically understood the January 6th insurrection as kind of a patriotic uprising, and a defense of democracy, So there definitely is a very strong connection between the events of January 6th and white Christian nationalist ideology.
Now, there are many similarities between white Christian nationalism and fascism, and yet the media over the past few years has been hesitant, at even times even apologetic about making that comparison. What just does white Christian nationalism have in common with fascism, and how does it differ, if at all?
It's a really complicated and much debated question, as you probably know. There's this quote that's often misattributed to Sinclair Lewis from the 1920s, from the original America, reacting to the original America First movement of that era, that if fascism ever comes to America, it will come carrying a cross draped in a flag, and that's one of the sources of the title of our book. So we obviously do take that very seriously. So there are lots of commonalities. There are lots of definitions of fascism. One is hyper-nationalism. One is hyper-masculinity. One is kind of ethno-cultural tribalism. Those are another is a kind of worship of a messianic leader. I mean, all of those things are certainly present within contemporary white Christian nationalism. I mean, I think people look at this and say, oh, well, but, where, no concentration camps and, sort of, jackbooted people marching through the street and no huge rallies. And I think part of what makes this tricky is that a lot of Americans, when they think of fascism, they tend to think of Nazism. But Nazism was just one version of fascism. There were others in Italy and Eastern Europe. There were fascist movements everywhere in the West, including in the United States. I mean, Hitler had many fans in the United States, and so did Mussolini. There were kind of somewhat admiring articles written even in mainstream outlets like the New Yorker and the New Republic and the Atlantic in the 20s and the 30s about these dictators who were sort of rallying their people and restoring order and so on and so forth. So in some ways, probably is a little beside the point, to sort of focus too much on whether or not this movement is fascist. I mean, there certainly are, however, similarities. And I think one thing that we can definitely say is that it is an increasingly authoritarian movement. It is, increasingly, a movement that is anti-democratic. And, regardless of whether we want to call it fascist, it is increasingly a threat to American democracy. And I think that's really the key point.
Do you think we could call it American fascism?
Yeah, to me, it's in some ways it's a kind of a maybe ultimately a semantic question, right? Which label you want to put on it. I mean, again, I think there are certainly parallels to these sort of earlier movements, these earlier America First movements, and certainly also in the kind of admiration that many people in this movement have for dictators abroad, for Putin, for Viktor Orban, who's essentially the dictator of Hungary at this point. Certainly, again, lots of strong resemblances to earlier fascist movements, but there are also differences as well. So I don't want to get too bogged down in this debate about whether or not the fascist label applies or not. I think it certainly sheds some light on it, but I think the danger of putting the fascist label on it is it makes it too easy for other people to sort of push back and reject it and just say, you're catastrophizing and exaggerating and demonizing. I mean, I think the threat that we face is serious enough, regardless of whether we want to call it fascism.
One of the interesting points you make in the book is that the so-called Christian nationalism isn't strictly Christian. That you pointed to one survey in which a fifth of those who identified as Christian also said that they were secular or belonged to some other religion. Can you unpack that, and what is that about?
I think there's a couple of things going on there. I think the main thing is that for many folks, Christian or evangelical has become a political label or an ethnic label as much as a kind of a religious or denominational identification. And that, of course, is in part just because of the kind of really tight embrace between conservative Christians and the Republican parties over the last 40-odd years. I think, too, that it partly just has to do with, in a way, the kind of secularization of evangelicalism itself, or to put it somewhat more metaphorically, the kind of cultural captivity of a lot of white Christianity, that the line between Christian faith and American culture has just been increasingly blurred, and you can really see this in some things like the mask controversy, or the vaccine controversies, or even more trivially these kind of quote unquote culture wars over things like gigantic sodas and plastic straws, which somehow become symbols of freedom that are somehow supposedly associated with Christianity. Those would be sort of the two main things, and sort of the most dramatic example of this is not just that there are non-church going folks who identify as Christians, that there are people who are not even Christians who identify as evangelical or support Christian nationalism. So not just atheists or secularists, but even Muslims, Hindus, and so on, right? Just because it is increasingly a political and cultural label, and it's a way of sort of saying I'm a real American, because that's a lot of what white Christian nationalism is. It says, the real Americans are white, native-born Christians, and if you're not all three of those things, you're not quite a real American. And so folks who are sort of outside of the charm circle say, well, but I'm super duper patriotic, so I am a real American. Like a good example of this is Nick Fuentes, the leader of the Proud Boys. I'm trying to remember exactly what his heritage is, but it's not sort of straightforwardly white as that term is understood it. But by being hyper masculine and hyper patriotic, it's sort of a way of saying, well, I might not be white, but I'm Christian, and boy, am I nationalist, and so I'm a real American.
Another really fascinating observation you make is that despite this really anti-black animus that's at the core of the Christian right now, that white Christian nationalism does not actually consider Muslims or atheists to be existentially threatening, that the real enemy are socialists, even if they can't define exactly what socialism is. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that was one of the sort of really interesting and surprising findings in the book, is that socialism is this label that just includes everything. It's a label that's just everything that we don't like. It's not Christian. It's humanistic. It's progressive. It's pacifistic and peace-loving. It's feminizing. It's just a kind of it's just a sort of a box that you throw everything you don't like into. And the truth is, if you look back historically, it's kind of worked that way for a really long time. The kind of big red scares during the 1920s, and then again during the Cold War, where communists were called pinkos, and sort of associating them also with homosexuality and femininity. So there's a long history of socialism just being used as this kind of catch-all category for people we don't like who stand for things that we're against.
You had mentioned earlier about the support that leaders like Putin are getting among the far right now. It's ironic that white Christian nationalism purports to uphold American values, but has great sympathy for tyrants like Putin, who is certainly no friend of the United States. How do you account for that?
I think there's sort of two things going on. One is that there's a sort of a fairy tale picture that some Americans have of Russia, which is it's uniformly white. It's very, very, very Christian. It's very, very orderly. That's just point for point incorrect. But that's the image that folks have. And then I think it is just, it is just Putin himself, right, who has, kind of portrayed him, he's kind of reinvented himself as a kind of a Christian culture warrior. He's, against homosexuality and gay marriage, and he's fighting terrorism and Islam, and he wants strong borders, and a lot of the things. Sort of gives off this image of wanting a lot of the same things that white Christian nationalists do. And then, of course, there's kind of the hyper masculinity and the strong man image. The kind of memes of him riding around bare chested on a horse, or kind of posing as this very, very, very strong figure, and in a way, it's kind of the leader that a lot of white Christian nationalists yearn for, right? A fighter, a strong leader who will, put all of our enemies back in their place, and kind of make things the way that they used to be again. I think that's part of the fascination, but at a deeper level, it also just sort of reflects a kind of a disillusionment with liberal democracy, and a kind of increasing attraction towards just a much more authoritarian form of politics.
One of the quotes, I'll quote your book here, that I found really interesting, was that you said, ironically, a serious attempt to make America great again would probably end up making it chaotic and poor. And you say that in the context of assuming that if Trump or one of his ilk came to power, that it would have disastrous consequences. Could you unpack that for us?
Sure. So we have lots of examples of people like Trump, like Putin, consolidating their power, right? Kind of coming to power through a democratic election, and then kind of gradually undermining democratic institutions and the rule of law, and kind of consolidating power and control. And these regimes are, first of all, they're kleptocratic regimes. They're the rulers and their family and cronies find various ways of enriching themselves. As you probably know, by some estimates, Putin is the richest man in the world, and certainly, we saw efforts in this direction, by Trump and his family to use the office of the presidency to enrich themselves. The latest example of this was, Jared Kushner's mysterious $2 billion capital raise in Saudi Arabia. Based on what? His proven track record as an investment manager? I don't think so. So that's part of it. Is just kleptocracy. That the people are first and foremost interested in enriching themselves and not bringing prosperity to the country. And then there's just as a result, tremendous power is consolidated through corruption. Kind of paying people off. Kind of keeping people in the inner circle, happy by, kind of greasing a lot of palms. And, for a market economy to work effectively, you need rule of law, you need secure property rights, you need a certain amount of financial transparency, and, all of those things disappear very, very rapidly in a regime like this. And, the last thing I would say is that, you wind up with a government that's staffed by people who are chosen on the basis of their loyalty as opposed to their competency. And, this is very explicit part of the kind of MAGA 2024 program. Steve Bannon has been patiently organizing, I think it's a list of 4,000 or 40,000 people, who would, they would just fire everybody in various agencies in Washington and just put a bunch of MAGA loyalists in their place. And these are, third and fourth rate people who have no experience, no special knowledge or training. And, how do you think that's going to work out? If you if you put some kind of, Bannon or Trump crony in charge of FEMA or in charge of the SEC or in charge of the EPA. I mean, do you think they're going to do a good job of sort of managing the economy or, managing disasters? I don't think so. It's that toxic cocktail of autocracy, corruption, incompetence that in country after country where strong men like this have come to power leads to economic ruination for the middle classes. And so, middle class folks who think that that putting somebody like that in office again is going to bring prosperity their way are will learn, I'm afraid, otherwise and very quickly.
Sometimes I feel, just as an American, so powerless when I see our government, which seems to be folding in the face of this. It's not that we don't have laws and checks and balances, but they're just not being enforced because of the level of partisanship in this country. And it feels sometimes like, we're on board of this juggernaut that's heading for the rocks. No matter what, we're going to hit them. What can we do as average citizens to fight this? What can we do to become part of the solution?
Well, I'm better at diagnosis than prescription, but I do certainly have some ideas about this. I do think the thing is that you have to we have to really build a kind of a broad alliance of folks in defense of liberal democracy, and this is going to reach all the way from democratic socialists like Bernie and AOC to never Trump former Republicans like Bill Kristol and Peter Wenner or David Frum, right? Folks who probably have pretty strong differences and would argue a lot about, say, economic policy or foreign policy, but do at least agree on basic things like separation of powers and rule of law and peaceful transitions of power, and are willing to defend those things. I do think now there will be time to argue over policy later, but right now the important thing is to defend democracy. The other thing is that folks who care about democracy need to get more engaged in local and state politics. The sort of forces of reaction have been engaged at that level for a very long time and are even more engaged now than they were. And a lot of these battles are going to be fought out in courthouses and state houses all around the country. This will become even more important if indeed Trump or somebody like Trump manages to get back into the White House and the Republicans recapture control of Congress in 2022 and 2024 seems very likely at the moment. That means that the kind of last bastions of democracy are going to be at the state and the local level. And I think the last thing that I would say, and this is speaking specifically to people of faith and Christians in particular, is to try to engage across some of these divides. There certainly are some people out there, and I've had conversation with such people who are just completely unpersuadable. They're just so dialed into Fox News and so far down the QAnon rabbit hole that any facts or statistics that I could possibly cite are just going to be dismissed as fake news or political bias on my part. But I think there are a lot of people who are reachable and persuadable, and I think there are, very serious conversations that are going on, in congregations and neighborhoods across the country, and it's important that those conversations continue. Folks who may be sympathetic to Christian nationalism kind of understand that it is in fact a heresy. It is a form of political idolatry. It is a form of self-worship, collective self-worship, disordered love, overweening pride. You're hearing the Augustinian, Niebuhrian in me, right now, but that is certainly how I see it. So I think that's important, and it's important to speak to folks in a Christian language then, or a theological language, or an ethical language, and not just in a historical and sociological one. I mean, I think that the kind of historical and sociological analysis can help us to see how we got where we are, but it doesn't provide the kind of political and moral guidepost that we need to move in the right direction. And that direction is to kind of try to finally realize this American promise of a multiracial democracy, or more poetically, a nation of nations and a people that Martin Luther King and others have articulated in the past, and that we've inched towards and then turned away from again and again. And I think the moment is now to move purposefully and finally in that direction. I do think that we're at an inflection point, a generational inflection point, and we can move that way, or we can move back to something that's going to be more like Jim Crow again, because I think that is ultimately the vision that white Christian nationalists have for us. It's just the kind of a euphemistic, kinder, gentler form of Jim Crow.
As a sociologist and a historian, have you seen, in your knowledge of history, any similar instance in our history where we've, kind of been on this brink of national suicide and we've come back from it? Or is this fairly unique as far as what we've faced as a nation?
Well, I think here I would say let's look back after the Civil War, right? I mean, Civil War, and then the period known as Reconstruction, when there were serious efforts made to enfranchise emancipated former slaves in the southern states, and to kind of really remake the United States as a multiracial democracy. I mean, that was a moment a little bit like the one that we're in, where there was then ferocious backlash. This is when the Ku Klux Klan emerges. This is what culminates in the establishment of the first Jim Crow. And look, I mean, the southern states during the Jim Crow era were proto-fascist. As you may know, Hitler actually sent lawyers and officials over to study the race laws in the Jim Crow South as a potential model for how they would try to, quote unquote, solve the Jewish problem, for the Nazi race laws, the so-called Nuremberg race laws. And the amazing thing is that they kind of concluded that the one-drop rule in the Jim Crow South was too harsh, right? That maybe somebody with a little bit of Jewish blood shouldn't be treated the same way as somebody who was 100% Jewish, I mean, in their terms. So, yeah, I think you have to realize that we had the Jim Crow South was an authoritarian one-party state that used various racial terrorism to hold a subordinate caste in place. So that's I think the kind of that's sort of the kind of fork in the road that we're looking at right now, is a return to a society in which they're just second-class citizens and first-class citizens, in which democracy is for some people and not for other people.
We've been talking to Dr. Philip Gorski, and he's the co-author with Sam Perry of The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. And that book is just out a few weeks ago, I think, right? And it's available on Amazon and various other booksellers.
Yep, it's been out since April 1st, and is available on all your online retailers and probably in some of your local bookstores too. So have a look.
Well, thank you so much for making time for us. Thank you for helping to put things into context and giving us the background history. Very, very important, very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Philip Gorski, and thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. And this is S.J. Munson signing off.